The convoy of British Army trucks wound through the devastated landscape of northwestern Germany on April 17, 1945, navigating roads cratered by artillery and littered with the debris of a collapsing Reich. The spring weather was unpredictable, alternating between brilliant sunshine that seemed to mock the destruction below and sudden cold rains that turned dirt roads to impassable mud. The men of the British Second Army's advance units had grown accustomed to the rhythms of conquest, securing towns, processing surrendering German soldiers, establishing temporary military government in communities where all civil authority had evaporated. They had liberated concentration camps and witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had accepted the surrender of Wehrmacht units whose soldiers were often relieved to be captured by the British rather than the Soviets advancing from the east. Yet nothing in their experience had prepared them for the intelligence report that had redirected their convoy that morning, a report so unusual that the commanding officer had initially questioned whether the information was accurate or whether translation errors had garbled the message's meaning. The report concerned a facility near the town of Rothenburg, an installation that German sources described as a detention center for female auxiliary personnel who had been deemed security risks or who had violated military regulations. The British intelligence officers who processed this information struggled to understand exactly what they were being told. The German military employed hundreds of thousands of women in auxiliary roles, communication specialists, administrative staff, anti-aircraft gun crews, medical personnel. But these women were not considered combatants under international law and were not supposed to be subject to imprisonment except for actual crimes. The idea of a detention facility specifically for German military women suggested something more complex than the straightforward POW camps the British had been processing for months. The intelligence report provided coordinates and a rough description of the facility's layout, but offered little clarity about what conditions the British rescue team might encounter, or what the status of the detained women actually was under either German or international military law. Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison commanded the unit assigned to investigate and secure the facility, a responsibility he approached with considerable uncertainty. Morrison was a career officer in his late 30s who had commanded troops throughout the Northwest Europe campaign, from Normandy to the Rhine crossing. He was experienced in dealing with the chaos of Germany's collapse, with the desperate civilians and disorganized military remnants who now inhabited the landscape. Yet the specific mission of liberating German military women from a German detention facility occupied a gray area in Morrison's understanding of his responsibilities. Were these women to be treated as prisoners of war despite their auxiliary status? Were they victims requiring rescue or enemy personnel requiring processing? Would they be cooperative or hostile when British forces arrived? Morrison's briefing to his men emphasized caution and humanity. They would approach the facility prepared for resistance, but would treat any women they encountered as potential victims until evidence suggested otherwise. The facility came into view as the convoy rounded a curve in the road, and its appearance immediately suggested that German descriptions of it as a detention center had been euphemistic at best. The compound consisted of several long wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fencing, with guard towers at the corners that were now unmanned. The resemblance to concentration camps the British had recently liberated was immediate and disturbing, though the facility was much smaller and showed signs of having been hastily abandoned rather than liberated through combat. No guards were visible, no German military presence remained, and the gates stood open as if whoever had been responsible for the facility had simply walked away when the approach of British forces made continued operation impossible. Morrison ordered his men to proceed carefully, uncertain whether the apparent abandonment was genuine or whether German forces might be waiting in ambush, using the facility as bait for an attack on the British column. British soldiers entered the compound with weapons ready, moving through the gates and spreading out to secure the perimeter and check the barracks for any remaining German military presence. What they found instead was a population of approximately 300 women, mostly in their 20s and 30s, wearing remnants of German military auxiliary uniforms that were dirty and worn, many of them showing signs of malnutrition and illness. The women's reaction to the British arrival was not relief or gratitude, but rather terror and confusion. Many retreated into the barracks or huddled together in groups, their expressions showing fear of what British soldiers might do to them. The disconnect between the British soldiers' expectations that they would be greeted as liberators by grateful victims and the reality of frightened women who viewed their arrival with dread created an atmosphere of profound awkwardness and mutual incomprehension that would take hours to begin to resolve. Morrison entered the largest barracks, accompanied by his German-speaking interpreter and several soldiers, intending to explain the situation and begin the process of determining what these women's status was and what their needs might be. The scene inside the barracks was heartbreaking. Women crammed into bunks designed for half their number, inadequate sanitation facilities, minimal heating despite the cold weather, signs of disease and malnutrition everywhere. Yet what struck Morrison most forcefully was not the physical conditions, which were poor but not as catastrophic as what he had seen in concentration camps, but rather the psychological state of the women. They showed the signs of people who had been systematically degraded and dehumanized, who had lost hope, and who expected nothing but further suffering regardless of who held authority over them. When Morrison attempted to address them, explaining in German through his interpreter that they were now under British protection and that their detention was ended, the women's reaction was not celebration but disbelief, mixed with suspicion that this was some kind of trick or test. The interpreter, a German Jewish refugee who had fled to Britain before the war and who now served with British forces, found himself deeply affected by the women's condition and response. He had expected to feel nothing but contempt for German military personnel, even women in auxiliary roles, given what the Nazi regime had done to his family and community. Yet faced with these specific women in this specific situation, he found his emotions more complicated. These were not the architects of Nazi policy or the perpetrators of concentration camp atrocities, but rather low-ranking personnel who had been caught up in the regime's machinery and who had then been victimized by that same machinery when they fell afoul of its arbitrary rules. His translation of Morrison's words and the women's responses became more than mere linguistic conversion. It became an attempt to bridge not just language but also profound cultural and psychological chasms between people whose recent experiences had been utterly different. As British medical staff began examining the women, the extent of their mistreatment became clearer. Malnutrition was widespread, with many women showing signs of having received inadequate food for extended periods. Respiratory infections and other illnesses that should have been treatable with basic medical care had been allowed to progress without treatment. Some women bore marks of physical abuse, bruises, scars, injuries that had healed improperly without medical attention. The medical conditions suggested systematic neglect rather than active torture, a pattern of deprivation and indifference that had taken a severe toll on women who had entered detention in generally good health. The British medical officer, Captain Sarah Williams, one of the few female officers in Morrison's unit, found herself struggling with conflicting emotions as she treated women who had served the enemy but who were now clearly victims requiring care and compassion. The process of understanding how these women had ended up in this facility required patient interviewing over several days, as women gradually began to trust that the British presence might actually represent an improvement in their circumstances rather than a new form of threat. The stories that emerged painted a picture of the Nazi regime's paranoia and brutality, even toward its own personnel in the war's final months. The women had been auxiliary personnel serving in various capacities: telephone operators, administrative clerks, medical assistants, anti-aircraft gun crews. Their offenses, to the extent they could be determined, ranged from actual infractions like desertion or theft to arbitrary accusations of defeatism, spreading rumors, or simply being in the wrong place when authorities needed scapegoats for military failures. The detention facility had been established in late 1944 as the German military's situation deteriorated and as paranoia about internal security threats reached hysterical levels. Women sent there faced conditions deliberately designed to punish and intimidate, with minimal food, no medical care, brutal guards, and the constant threat of transfer to concentration camps if their behavior or attitude was deemed unsatisfactory. What shocked Morrison and his staff most profoundly was discovering that the women's fear of British soldiers stemmed from propaganda and from actual policies that the German military had communicated to its personnel. The women had been told that Allied soldiers, particularly British and American forces, would rape and murder German women as a matter of policy. That capture meant not protection, but rather a different form of victimization. This propaganda had been reinforced by the guards at the detention facility, who had told the women that British arrival would mean their deaths, and that their only hope was for German forces to hold off the Allied advance long enough for some miraculous reversal of Germany's military fortunes. The women's terror upon seeing British soldiers was thus not irrational, given what they had been told to expect, but rather a rational response to propaganda that had convinced them their lives were in immediate danger. Breaking through this fear and mistrust required patience and tangible demonstrations that British intentions were genuinely humanitarian. Morrison ordered his men to maintain strict discipline around the women, to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as threatening, and to allow the female medical and support staff in his unit to take the lead in interactions where possible. Food supplies were brought in and distributed, medical treatment was provided, and efforts were made to improve the barracks conditions while arrangements were made for the women's transfer to proper facilities where their status could be formally determined. The transformation in the women's demeanor over the first 48 hours was remarkable. From terrified groups who huddled together and flinched at any male approach to individuals who began to interact with British personnel, to ask questions about their future, to express gratitude for food and medical care that they had not expected to receive. One woman in particular became a spokesperson of sorts for the group, a former communications specialist named Margaret Hoffman, who spoke some English and who had enough education to understand the legal complexities of their situation. Hoffman explained to Morrison that the women feared they would be treated as prisoners of war despite their auxiliary status, that they would spend years in captivity, that their families would never learn what had happened to them. Morrison found himself in the awkward position of explaining that while the women were technically in British custody, their status was fundamentally different from combat POWs, that British policy was to process auxiliary personnel quickly and return them to civilian status as soon as practical security concerns were addressed. This explanation required Morrison to navigate complicated questions about collective guilt, individual responsibility, and the distinction between serving in auxiliary roles for a criminal regime and actually participating in that regime's crimes. The British military's handling of these women became something of a test case for policies that were still being developed regarding how to process the millions of Germans who had some connection to the Nazi military machine without being actual combatants. The decision was ultimately made to treat the women as displaced persons requiring humanitarian assistance rather than as prisoners of war requiring long-term detention. After medical treatment and basic screening to ensure none were wanted for war crimes, the women were released to return to their homes or to displaced persons camps if they had nowhere else to go. This decision was controversial among some British personnel who felt that anyone who had served the Nazi regime in any capacity deserved punishment rather than assistance, but it reflected a pragmatic recognition that Germany's reconstruction would be impossible if every person who had any connection to the military was treated as an enemy requiring indefinite detention. For the women themselves, the British rescue team's arrival and the treatment they received afterward represented a profound psychological shock that many struggled to process. They had expected death or abuse and instead received medical care, adequate food, and relatively humane treatment. This dissonance between Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality and the reality of British behavior forced a reckoning with the lies they had been told and the nature of the regime they had served. Some women expressed this realization openly, acknowledging that they had believed propaganda that now seemed obviously false. Others remained silent about their internal processing, perhaps struggling with cognitive dissonance or perhaps simply focused on survival and reunification with families rather than on larger questions of ideology and propaganda. Captain Williams, who spent extensive time with the women during their medical treatment and processing, found herself reflecting on the complicated nature of victimhood and complicity in the context of totalitarian regimes. These women had served the Nazi military, had contributed in small ways to the regime's ability to wage aggressive war and commit atrocities. Yet they had also been victimized by that same regime, had been subjected to conditions that violated basic human dignity, had been treated as disposable resources to be used and discarded. Williams concluded that both things could be true simultaneously, that the women bore some responsibility for their choices to serve the regime, but also deserved compassion and assistance as victims of that regime's cruelty. This nuanced understanding was perhaps more psychologically sophisticated than the simple categories of guilty and innocent that structured much wartime thinking. But it was necessary for dealing humanely with the complex realities of Germany's collapse. The incident also highlighted the gender dynamics of war and military service in ways that challenged both German and British assumptions. The German military had mobilized women extensively for the war effort while maintaining official ideology that emphasized traditional feminine roles. When these women became inconvenient or were accused of infractions, the military institution had discarded them with particular cruelty, sending them to detention facilities where they were treated worse than male soldiers accused of similar offenses. The British rescue team's response reflected their own society's gender assumptions. Morrison and his men felt particular discomfort at finding women in such conditions, felt that the mistreatment of women was somehow worse than the mistreatment of men, even though both represented violations of human dignity. These gender assumptions influenced how the women were processed and treated, generally to their benefit, but in ways that revealed how deeply gendered both societies remained despite the war's disruptions of traditional roles. The long-term fate of these specific women remains largely unknown, lost in the chaos of post-war Germany, where millions of displaced persons moved through temporary camps and facilities before returning to whatever remained of their former lives. Some likely returned to families and communities that had survived the war. Others found themselves permanent refugees in a destroyed country with no home to return to. Whether any maintained contact with the British personnel who had liberated them, whether they ever expressed publicly the disconnect between what they had expected from their liberators and what they actually experienced, remains undocumented. What is clear is that for Morrison and the others in the British rescue team, the encounter was profoundly affecting, forcing them to think more complexly about Germans as human beings capable of both perpetrating and experiencing injustice, about the nature of victimhood in wartime, and about their own responsibilities as occupying forces in a defeated nation.